Honourable Mr. Michael Soften.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be brief in my remarks, but I believe that these amendments are sufficiently important as to merit a perspective not just like those that were so ably given by those who spoke before me, not simply on the sections that are subject to the amendment, and on the reasons and on the progress that we are now making in this conversation and in this area of law. But I simply have a few remarks to make, sir, on what I see as the landscape in which these amendments are being made. What I see as the policy and legislative coherence that this government is bringing to this Parliament and through this Parliament to the people of this country. The honourable member who spoke before me made reference to some of it. He mentioned the fact that in the cybercrime legislation, which the report on which, having gone before the Standing Committee on Governance, is now before the Senate, and that has seen some amendments that we will soon discuss. That legislation also demonstrates a certain level of legislative coherence, and I want us all to appreciate the importance of that. Essentially to say that there will be no safe harbor under the law for people who seek to offend in this way, whether it is in the child justice legislation, child protection legislation, in the sexual offences legislation as being amended here today or proposed to be amended here today, or in the cybercrime legislation. Because to the extent that the cybercrime legislation makes reference to child pornography as an offence, to child grooming as an offence, as does this legislation in both regards, and to online child sexual abuse as an offence, that we are making sure that across all of the relevant areas where people may act, that children and people who require protection are protected. You know, sir, it seems to me, especially given recent events with respect to cybercrime, that we seem to feel as if one area is theoretical or virtual, that crimes that take place in this jurisdiction or this domain are not real, but they have real consequences. And in fact, child grooming can be so, to the extent that it is often invisible online. The Honourable Attorney General gave a story of a young man who was the victim of sexual grooming as a minor by an adult. And people are seeing all of the times that he happens to meet up with this young man. In an online environment, people are not seeing. And so, in fact, we have an even greater responsibility to protect young people in those environments. I had occasion to say recently during an opening of a business that the other thing that we will be coming to examine very soon and asking the participation of the public on this is how do we protect and speak to children's online activity when it comes to things like gaming. The amount of time that children spend online, the kinds of activities that they're doing online. There was a recent report that assessed the danger of certain common online activities that children do. And one of the ones that was flagged, and I'll call the name because this is a public report, is a game that many of our children play. So it is not necessarily Fortnite or Grand Theft Auto. Some of us even in here play some of the ones that I'm calling. But Roblox which is something that 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds play, has been deemed as one of the most dangerous, not necessarily because of the game itself, but because of the communities that convene around these games, and the conversations that take place, and the fact that actually often there are adults and others who would seek to do harm lurking in these environments, engaging our children, and it is one of the things that we have to be able to turn some attention to. So, sir, I speak to the coherence because I want us all to appreciate that these are direct and intentional efforts by a government to increase protection for those who would be vulnerable. The child justice legislation, the child protection legislation, the fact that, and I'll come to it in a minute, that we saw it fit to remove wandering as an offense because of the harm that it was causing and because of the fact that it was not allowing us to have a frank conversation about why children may leave the environments in which they live and go to other places. But sir, one of the main points I want to make is simply this: that sexual and gender-based violence is a continuum. And that is why we've treated grooming in the way that we have. It is a continuum. Sexual and gender-based violence and the environment that we create when we allow for these kinds of acts to take place without bringing to bear the full weight of the law and of our other legislative actions, of our other actions as a society, when we allow them to go unchecked, is when people are no longer protected. The Honourable Member for St. George North made reference to this in the beginning of her remarks, is that any consciousness, any national consciousness that allows a person to take control of another person's body for their own pleasure or for their own will to be done. We see that in many kinds of acts, sir, of criminal acts. We see it in rape and incest, as is covered by this legislation. We see it in gender-based violence. It is part of the same thinking. It is part of the same position and approach, that a person believes that what happens to your body, to another person's body, is for me to determine. So if you say something I don't like, because I am stronger than you and larger than you, I will slap you in your face. If you take a decision that affects my life in some way that I determine, even though it is your decision to make, I may choose to end your life. Sir, the incidents of rape and other forms of sexual violence, the incidents of gender-based violence that often ends in murder in this country and in this region, is one that is only addressed when we take these kinds of steps to send the message that a person's bodily autonomy has to be protected by the state. Now, I would have to go further to say that how we treat children and whether we determine that we can discipline a child by striking a child or by force is also a part of that conversation. Because how can we choose where a minor and under what circumstances a minor is protected from violence? That is a part of the conversation that we have to continue. But I also wish to say that, as others have said before, it is not just about what we write into law and what we enforce under the law. It is also about the other actors. I hear people use language, when I say the other actors, I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about how we talk about these things in our schools, in our churches, in the corridors. I hear people say things like, that fella interfere with she. Somebody trouble her. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. And we do that because we're trying to make it seem benign. We're trying to be polite about something that is not polite at all. You heard the member from St. Philip North talk about her experience as a doctor with dealing with survivors of sexual violence. It is not polite. So to say that somebody troubled somebody, I do not use that language. And I do not know what you mean when you use that language. Was the person raped, sexually assaulted? What was the act? Because it's only when we get real and confront what is happening to people that we understand the severity of what we are dealing with here. A girl who is sexually assaulted was not troubled, and she was not interfered with. And similarly, the language in the media has to be frontally addressed. Because so often we are talking about cases of rape, we are talking about cases where a minor, as this legislation says, cannot consent, and we say that the minor has had sex with, or that the adult has had sex with. You cannot have sex with a minor as an adult. That is rape. And so until we start to get very clear in our language and not treat things under the cover of giggles and blushing and acting as if it is some kind of little community secret, it is only then that we will start to really address and start to have a frank conversation about, beyond legislation, what are the measures, what are the activities, what is the action by each of us that is going to begin to change and to move this situation. It also relates to the sexualization of children. And it is something that we do because we want to take nice pictures sometimes. But there are ways in which, and I'll give an example. We would have a baby, a boy, 1 year old, 2 years old. And this is a baby in arms, and you bring this baby to a fair or to a karaoke, and the baby starts reaching out to women around or to men around or to somebody. And because often women congregate around a baby that they haven't seen before, and the child reaches out, they'll say, I see, he liked the girls already. He's girls' man. I know that we think that we are joking, but it comes from a certain kind of consciousness that we start to sexualize children even before they can walk. We start to say things like, there's somebody has a boy child and somebody has a girl child, and they're toddling around, and one person says, give she a kiss. For what? We think that these are harmless kinds of utterances, but they are not. The way in which we allow children to express themselves has to be removed at that stage in their lives from this kind of sexual framing. The way that we dress our children, 4 and 5 and 6 year olds, has to be removed from this kind of sexual framing. That is not to say, sir, that we don't have to leave room for sexual development as a stage of a child's development. Because that is the other perversion of what we do. We over-sexualize children from 0 to 14. And then at the point at which children are actually fully coming into their sexual identity, we tell them, you're a woman in here. Which is it? It is time for us to be able to have a real and frank conversation about sexual expression throughout a person's life cycle, so that we don't have these hushed tones and whispers when the wrong thing happens in our communities, in our schools, in our sporting and social clubs, in our churches. You know, I often remark on what I perceive sometimes as the dilemma that faces young women who, I went to a consultation many years ago a consultation on, with respect to the education sector and sexual and reproductive rights with respect to the education sector and the school system and so on. And one man who was an educator, many years ago, it has to be over 15 years now, got up and said, but what are we going to do about these girls in the schools with these breasts? What are we going to do about these girls in the schools with these breasts as if they could leave them home? His problem was that he felt uncomfortable with the literal sexual expression of a woman and the fact that she's leaving home with that. There's an extent to which we want to police that too. We want to tell women when to be women, when to express their sexuality, and when it doesn't suit us. These are conversations that we have to be having. The final thing I want to say, sir, I promised to be short, is that there's also such a thing as something that is suitable for a child, for an adult, that is not suitable for a child. And as parents, as communities, as a society, to be able to draw that line. The notion that certain kinds of cultural expression, as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition made reference to today, must be removed because children exist among us is absurd. There are all kinds of behaviors that our parents said to us, this is not for you at this time. This is for adult people at this time. But the dilemma that we have is that we are not having a frank conversation. We are not having a conversation which says to our young people, it is all right for you to want to like a boy or for a boy to like you. I will tell you that when I was growing up, there was this idea in my home, in my community, that as long as you were living in the home of an adult who was responsible for you, that you were a child. Right? So you are 17, 18, 19. You are living in the home of an adult who's responsible for you. And so in none of those paths of development, as either a boy child or a girl child, are you supposed to express. And so, you know, I have godchildren and who would come and tell me that they like a girl. I would have a conversation with them. What does that mean to you? How do you all express that? Not when I was growing up. You could like a boy and tell your mother. You better like some schoolwork. And while that had its effect, what was absent in that context was an honest conversation. What does it mean to you to like a boy? How do you express that? Talk to me about that. Tell me about that. Tell me about how you're feeling. It is only when we create that safe environment for children to start to step into their sexual identity. It starts when they're children. Let us not fool ourselves. It starts when they are still in our care. And if we don't send a message to them that their sexual identity and expression has a safe space in which to exist, we are going to continue to have poor decision-making among our young people when it comes to sexual expression and sexual behavior. And we will also continue to have an environment in which they do not come to us and tell us when someone has harmed them. This is a matter for legislation, and I very much welcome these amendments, but it is so much more a matter for conversation among ourselves, with our children, and with all the institutions that have to be responsible for protection in this country. Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to you.